All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Costumers of Color Silk Route Symposium 2023. My name is Kate Newton. I'm known in the Society for Creative Anachronism as Magistra Beatriz Alvarez de la Hoya. My specialty is in Spanish clothing and culture from 1480 to 1530. And today I will be doing a short overview of the silk industry in Spain. So the basic framework for this talk today is that first we will look at a timeline of the silk industry in Iberia, so when it started and where it developed. Then we'll talk a brief bit about silk in Al-Andalus and then silk in the Christian kingdoms. So as you may know, Al-Andalus retained at least partial control of the Iberian Peninsula up until 1492. So the bulk of the silk industry that we find in Iberia was either originated by or belonged to the Andalusian kingdoms, the caliphates there. So for a quick sample, this is a map of Spain in the 13th and 14th century during the Reconquest. So you can see down towards the bottom are the areas that were covered by the Moorish kingdom, and then across the top are the Christian kingdoms that we'll be discussing. So eventually, towards the end of what is known as the SCA period, up to 1600, the Moorish Caliphate was pushed down through the Iberian Peninsula and clung on to the very edge at Granada until about 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella completed what was known as the Reconquista and expelled the rest of the Moors from the territory. So a general timeline of the silk industry in Iberia. From what we're able to tell, in the 8th century CE, Arab tribes from Syria, who made up the bulk of the first wave of Moorish settlers or conquerors in the Iberian Peninsula, introduced the red mulberry tree and silkworms to Iberia, which was then known as Al-Andalus. And this is important because the breed of silkworms that they brought with them from the Middle East could only consume red mulberry as opposed to white or black. So they brought with them both the means of producing silk and the means of sustaining their methods of production. So this is the first appearance of sericulture, of silk work, silk cultivation in the Iberian Peninsula. In the 9th century, Al-Andalus and Muslim Sicily exported an enormous amount of silk textiles to Christian Europe. So for the first 100 years, the silk industry was restricted to the Iberian Peninsula, sometimes traded around the Mediterranean with other Moorish countries. But then in the 9th century, they began to export to the rest of Europe. And by the 11th and 12th century CE, silk textile manufacture in Al-Andalus was at its absolute height. Throughout the 12th century, you start to see the luxury silk production industry being introduced to Italy through Lucca. And from Italy, from Lucca, it quickly spreads across all of the Italian kingdoms. So suddenly the Moorish territories do not have the kind of monopoly that they'd had on luxury silk before. And in the 13th century, you see a sudden steep decline as the Moorish industry takes a dive due to the Reconquista. So as the Christian kingdoms push their way down south, they slowly start taking over the silk industry as well. The Moors lose it and the Christians gain it. So by the 14th century, there's a rise of the silk industry in Christian Valencia. Valencia is on the northeast coast of the Iberian Peninsula, up near Catalonia and just below the Kingdom of Aragon. So Valencia really lays the foundation for an import trade as well from the Italies and France. There is an enormous appetite for silk fashion in Iberia that for many years the trade in Valencia could not support. It took time for the Spanish to get the silk industry back on its feet after the Reconquista, is they would take over these territories and these industries and then have to relearn and rebuild them back up again. So in the 15th century, Italian import trades of silk start to decline again as Valencian silk evolves and begins to spread. And then by the 16th century, the silk industries in Spanish towns like Toledo, Zaragoza, and Valencia begin to outstrip foreign imports. And those three cities, Toledo, Zaragoza, and Valencia, are still the centers of silk production in Spain today. So let's look at some of the silk textiles in Al-Andalus. I have some samples of extant textiles and extant garments to look at, as well as some information about the types of textiles that were produced in those regions. So Al-Andalus was known for the production of 6 particular types of silk. We don't have a complete description of each of these, but they are all mentioned frequently in garment records, in inventories of the time, of sales records, etc. So first there was khaz, which is a high grade of silk fabric. It was one of the highest grades. So I think it's fair to imagine it as fairly smooth, very much free from slubs or blemishes, and one of the top qualities. Then you have mulkham, which is a plain fabric that is warped with silk and wefted with another fiber. So often cotton or linen, but sometimes wool. It would be slightly iridescent, a little bit changeable, but as I said, more of a plain weave, something like a tabby, and more frequently found in inventories as sort of an everyday silk. This is not, a high glossy special occasion fiber. This is the, minor merchant's wife's outer dress for a Tuesday. Then we get into the very higher end. Dibaj was a glossy figured silk. So patterns, usually florals or animals, but sometimes people, or just geometrics with a very high shine to it. So it was a very polished silk, very special occasion. This was very favored by the caliphates and emirate at the time. This was one of their preferred decorative silks. Related to that is something called siklatun, which is actually derived from Byzantine silk. So it's a monochrome ground. Sometimes it could be multicolored, but mostly all one shade, that would be decorated with roundels. So round decorative pieces, also made out of silk, either woven as brocade or embroidered with more silk. And it would feature, things like palm leaves or pomegranates or birds, and would be sewn in a geometric pattern all over the garment. So it's very much reminiscent of earlier Byzantine robes. Then we have atabi, which is another taffeta silk fabric that is made up of different fibers. So silk warp, and always cotton weft. More durable than pure silk often, still with a little bit of a shine, but somewhat plainer. And finally, sendal, which is something that is a term that's still used today, which is silk fabric interwoven with gold. So it could be a whole unbroken piece of fabric that's basically shot gold. Sometimes it would be warped in silk and wefted in gold, and sometimes it would be warped in silk and then brocaded in gold thread. So this was also, like dibaj, one of the higher grades of silk, one of the more expensive and more desired that you would get. In the 9th century, the first silk workshop shows up in Cordoba in Spain under the Moors. It was the name of the workshop was the Dar al Tirad, and Tirad in Moorish often refers to a strip of fabric. It formally refers to, and in ways that most of us would know, to embroidered bands that would be sewn onto a man's aljuba, his outer tunic, that would carry prayers or blessings, different motifs. Almost always worn, like I said, on men's garments, sometimes worn on their turbans. Occasionally you'll see a tiraz patch sewn on a turban. As time went by, tiraz basically became the word for stripes or strips of fabric, but it was also specifically the name that the Moors had for silk fabric. So Dar al-Tiraz actually means house of silk. So, like I said, these were the Royal Silk Workshops founded in Cordoba, and they mainly produced something that was known as Spaniscum, which was Spanish silk fabric. That was the word outside of Spain for Spanish silk, was Spaniscum. They also made a fabric called tapas which were silk tapestries that were often used for curtains or hangings or carpets. And those would be silk tapestries with bird and floral motifs. So it's what we often think of now as Moorish textile. They also made veils, curtains, different brocades, different types of sandals, and turbans. And all of these things would be woven special on their own types of looms. So veils were a certain size, a certain length. Turbans are usually 12 to 16 inches wide and 10 feet long of silk, and they're woven to a particular measurement. And the main Moorish silk production centers at the time were in Granada, Malaga, and Almeria. And Almerian silk was known across Western Europe for its high quality and its unrivaled color, especially the crimson. And this is before the time of cochineal. So they were achieving crimson without having access to New World fibers. Crimson remained at the top of Moorish color production, especially in silk, until about the 13th century, when it began to really lose ground to Flemish fabrics, like the Flemish, especially Flemish wools, but their silks were also much richer in color, much better saturated, and much longer lasting. So now to look at some pieces. These are some beautiful extant textiles. Everything that I'm posting today is from the Met in New York City, so you can go and look at these. On the far left is a textile fragment, a brocade. It's a late 12th to early 13th century Moorish, probably a garment fragment, but it is silk with metal wrapped thread, described as a brocaded lampus. Lampus is more of a common description outside of Moorish territory, but it basically meant a brocade with silk and metal. Then in the middle is a textile fragment from the shrine of San Librada in Sigüenza Cathedral in Spain. This was probably either a religious vestment or an altar cloth. It's from the first half of the 12th century, and it is again the lampus silk with metal wrapped thread. They do a lot of silk with metal, so very lustrous, I imagine, with the combination of that sort of warm silk and then the brighter metal. But you can see how intricate the weaving is. It took a long time for Europe to reach the same level of brocade weaving complexity that was seen in the Moorish and Middle Eastern countries until this point. But you can see the center one has that huge eagle in the center, and then a sort of cat or dog pattern around the outside, various beasts, stars and flowers. And this piece is actually fairly small. It's much smaller than you would expect from that complexity. And then on the far right, there's a textile fragment from the late 14th and early 15th century. And I include this because this is an example of a Moorish textile that was used on a royal Spanish garment, a Christian Spanish garment. It's not clear if the text in the middle, which is referred to in the museum as pseudo-Kufic, if it was intended to say anything or if it has become so stylized that it's really lost the meaning. But these striped fabrics woven with textual inspired designs were very popular under Isabella in Spain. Isabella, well known for being the queen who conquered Boabdil, the final caliph of Granada, and expelling the Moors from the country, then adopted a lot of their fashions, which really goes a long way to making the character of Spanish clothing somewhat different than the rest of Europe. And speaking of Boabdil, this has recently gone viral in a lot of online spaces. We're now into extant garment. This is the MARLOTA of Boabdil, so his outer jacket from the 15th century. This is reputed to be the garment that he actually surrendered to Isabella in. And it's difficult to judge scale from the photo framed the way it is, but this would be a ankle to floor length garment, very large. A lot of Moorish outer garments, the aljuba, the marlota, etc., are cut extremely wide to show off as much of the fabric as possible. So it's conspicuous consumption, but you get these very angular, either rectangular or triangle cuts, which show off as much of this extraordinarily expensive and beautifully woven fabric as you possibly can. This is a figured silk velvet, so it is stamped or woven in different heights of pile of velvet overall in a geometric pattern that's still clearly distinguishable, and it's edged in gold and silk thread braid decoration, and all of the closures are braided gold and silk thread as well. If you look closely at photos, there are 2 belt slits or pocket slits near the waist, and those are also bound off in the gold and silk thread. So this is an incredibly expensive garment, very high status. Unfortunately, that's one of the few extant pieces of clothing we have from the Moors. Between the expulsion and the fact that medieval peoples frequently reused textiles in new clothing, we've lost a lot of Moorish garmentry. We have a few more from Christian Spain. You're going to see nearly everything that I had access to as we go through this, as we now turn our eye to silk textiles in Christian Spain. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep hitting my forward button too hard. I apologize for that. So, over in Christian Spain, in 1316, the Valencian silk industry becomes the property of the Christians again. They have reconquered it from the Moors. And for the first time in this year, the silk industry issues a set of statutes that identify different trades within the silk industry. So they delineate and name silk dyers and velvet weavers and people who made purses, people who made embellishments, people who made belts. So there was a whole umbrella of the silk industry over these little clusters of industries within it. And a lot of the people who peopled those industries would be women. The silk women in Spain were nearly as famous as the English and French silk women of the same time periods. In 1477 to 1479 in Valencia, we have the founding of the first guild of velvet weavers. Valencia has some of the best records of the silk industry in all of Iberia, which is why so many of my examples rely on their data. So we have a very limited guild of velvet weavers, Valencian. And then in 1497, the silk dyers in Valencia formed their own guild, the Brotherhood of the Archangel St. Michael. At the same time, the Spanish silk industry is starting to bring in foreign technology. So they are sort of acquiring or luring away or hiring silk workers from Genoa, Liguria, Lucca, Venice, and Paris to bring European technology into Spain to try to increase their reach with their silk products. So there is an amazing inventory of Isabella I's wardrobes that's available online. It is a full inventory of everything that she owned at the time of her death, complete with prices, yardages, and intended garments for pieces that had not been cut. So I took a sample of the major type of silk textiles from her inventory, just to give you an idea of the type of silks that would be available to a person between 1300 and say 15 or 1600. So some of these will be familiar. Some of them are very close to the words that we have now. Brocado or brocade was, of course, a figured silk fabric. We still really value brocades today, especially silks. This is sort of the epitome of a luxury fabric. You also have altibajo, which is an embroidered silk velvet. And these, the alti is from alto, meaning tall, and bajo means short. It's from the word that means short. So it's short and tall, meaning that the the embroidery would be slightly thicker or taller than the velvet pile. So it would stand out from the background a bit. There is a type of silk that has largely been lost called alceatuni, which is a glossy figured silk. So embroidered or woven and then polished to a high gloss. Kepti and keti, you'll notice those are at opposite corners, are really heavily mentioned in a lot of 15th and 16th century Spanish clothing sources, but there's not the best descriptions of both of them. Kepti we do better with. It's a dense, heavy silk satin that was originally manufactured in the town of Ceuta, and that's where it gets its name. Now, keti, incredibly popular, especially with the Moorish countries, continuing on into the Renaissance, and then Moorish conversos would still wear it. So it was a popular silk fabric. The closest I can reckon that is that it would have been like satin, but potentially less heavy due to the types of garments it tended to be used in. Kepti you see in outer garments. Keti you tend to see in more undergarments. It's probably not quite as light as a lining, but more of a garment weight. Then you have raso, which is just a silk satin, no information about anything that distinguishes it from other. Damasco, our modern damask, silk fabric interwoven with gold thread. So there's a real love of silk and gold together. Terciopelo, which is a specific name for a type of silk velvet, much like taffetan, which is silk taffeta specifically. So you can imagine brocades, velvets, different types of velvets, satins, and then silk linings, hundreds of types of silk linings. So we are very rich in silk in Christian Spain. And these are some of our extant textiles. And you can see they have maintained the intricacies of Moorish weaving. And in a lot of situations, they have maintained the artistic influences as well as the weaving techniques. So this 14th century fragment on the left is a really good example of a combination of that earlier Moorish sort of Byzantine style with the woven in roundels. But this particular art style is usually referred to as Hispano-Moresque. So it's a combination of Spanish and Moorish. So the very pointed flowers, the roundels, the particular types of knots that are woven in are very Moorish, and then the use of color and the more free-form florals around the edges of the roundels are more Spanish. It's a very particular art style at a very particular moment in time. Now, in the center, this textile fragment from the 13th century retains a lot more of the sort of classical Moorish style. This is a pair of parrots facing each other over a tree or a shrub, and it's woven in silk with silver gilt threads. So that's why it has sort of a greenish yellow cast to it. The silver thread tends to turn greenish with time. So softer, sort of more rounded edges. That's a big difference between the Moorish and a lot of the Spanish. A lot of the Moorish designs tend to be very geometric. As we see on the far right-hand side, the silk brocade fragment from the late 15th and early 16th century. So these are Moorish stars combined with much less geometric florals. And interestingly enough, I mean, this almost looks like a wallpaper stencil that you could have purchased in the 1980s from Joanne, with the hearts and the almost German or Dutch tulip pattern down the middle. It looks very modern to our eye. So, wrapping things up here, let's take a look at some extant clothing. We are very lucky to have an enormous number of, or enormous by comparison, number of garments from the royal burials at the Las Huelgas Monastery in Burgos. And multiple burials have been exhumed. The clothing has been studied, sometimes taken out and restored, replaced with replicas, so we can actually see clothing that people wore. This particular garment is the pellote, or outer garment, of Leonor, Queen of Castile, from the 13th century. So this is a silk brocade that is colored with vegetable dye in green, cream, white, and gold. So the colors are fairly close to the original, although there has been some staining, probably grave staining, and a bit of wear. But there are the geometric patterns of diamonds and floral shaped decorations, and then you get the bands of geometric pattern around the front. And these patterns are really clearly influenced by, Andalusian work. So it's probably from a workshop in Granada. The interesting thing about this is it is extant enough so that we can see how this garment was cut. And you'll notice that the two big wide side gores, they did not really bother to match the pattern entirely. The emphasis was more on using as much of the fabric as you could than maintaining the integrity of the design. The medieval Spanish eye didn't consider this to be unattractive or a mistake. It just meant that you got to show off more of your fabric. In that same vein with the peyote, or we would call it a sideless surcoat, is the peyote of Enrique I, one of the Infanta princes from the 13th century. And this is a striped silk fabric edged with different gold strips. So the armholes, neckline are bound off in that silk. Then the front seams are covered with silk, and the fringe around the bottom, that decorative cutting, is also covered with strips of applied silk. This coat is amazing, and it's even more amazing when you realize that it's part of a full set of garments that were all made in this same fabric. This is the coat of the Infante Fernando de la Cerda, who was one of the potential heirs to the throne of Castile in the 13th century. And he was buried in a full suite of clothing that had the quartered heraldry of the kingdoms of Castile y Leon, which was intended to emphasize his claim to those thrones. The full burial suite includes this coat, a peyote that is of the same length, made of the same heraldic clothing. We'll look in a moment at his cap, which has the same heraldic pattern. He had stockings in this pattern, and he also had a gilt and silver embroidered sword belt that replicated the pattern. So this is an all-over brocade, silk fabric embroidered in silk threads, patterned with this quartered heraldry. So if you can imagine the gold and the silk and the layers and layers and layers of pattern, as I said, it was about consumption rather than sort of modern ideas of matching or coordinating. We have one more peyote of the Infanta Maria from the 13th century. And this is a beautiful like, golden cream striped fabric that was originally lined with fur. The fur has unfortunately rotted away, so we can't really see that. But you can see this is a garment that would be for a younger child. It's a bit shorter, and it is still extant. And then we have one more body garment, the tunic of Dona Teresa, and her burial garments have been extensively studied by Spanish archaeologists. There is a grave goods report that can be had from the monastery of Las Huelgas that was published as a book that has an analysis of every piece of clothing that came out of her grave. This is from the early 14th century. It's exactly 1300. And her tunic is really a mix of that sort of Hispano-Moresque patterns, but you can see it also has knotworks up over the shoulders that almost look like German brickwork embroidery. So you're seeing the influence of European countries sort of creep in. And then around the bottom, it has that very Byzantine-esque roundels with birds and animals in it. Then from the 15th century, this is the latest example we have, you start to see silk and velvet, more of the surviving pieces become ecclesiastical garments. So this is a priest's cope or cloak that is a silk velvet embroidered over with gold. And then the area around the scapular, the scapula bones, so the scapular at the back is also embroidered gold and silk on a silk tabby piece of fabric. Now, some of the small objects that I promised you, we have a couple of seal bags from the middle range of our time period. To the left, this is Hispano-Moresque in style. So it's a good blending of that early Spanish fashion with more Moorish style. It's from the 13th century, and it's patterned all over with a Kufic script. So this will look very much like that band textile that I showed you earlier. In the middle, this is actually silk embroidery called punta de cesteria or basket stitch, completely covering a woven linen liner piece. So this has been, hand embroidered by a purse maker in Catalonia. And as I said to the right, this is Fernando de la Cerda's cap. So you can see the alternating arms of Castile y Leon from the 13th century. It's silk embroidered with gold and silver. And you can just imagine he must have been absolutely resplendent. So that's the information that I have for you right now. I promised you a gentle overview of the history of silk in Spain. Again, my name is Beatriz Alvarez de la Hoya, or Kate Newton, and you can reach me most easily at my website, SpanishSeamstress.com. Please be sure to tune in for the other videos by our co-presenters in the Costumers of Color Silk Route Symposium. Check us all out on YouTube. Please support the Costumers of Color's good work, and thank you for listening.